Supreme Court Showdown. What's at stake?
It's time for U.S. World Report. Here's Tom Osborne.
These are the stories making headline news this week. Our report will now be heard on our new broadcast, U.S. World Report. Join our news team of Republican, Democrat, Liberal, and Independent as we continue to be your go-to news group on international and domestic affairs. Find me, Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb now on U.S. World Report. President Trump's administration says it will comply with family reunification deadlines, but Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar says deadlines are artificial and preventing the government from meeting its standard of the vetting process. After a string of ethics scandals, Scott Pruitt is out as EPA administrator. President Trump tweeted Thursday he had accepted his resignation, confirming that Pruitt will no longer lead. Andrew Wheeler will assume duties as the acting administrator of the EPA. And President Trump has narrowed his list of Supreme Court candidates to 3. Speculators named Judges Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett as the top 2, with Raymond Kethledge a possible 3rd, even though imminent, an announcement is scheduled for Monday. Trapped Thai boys appear in good spirits in new reporting from the cave from which they were rescued as rising floodwaters threatened. The 12 boys and their soccer coach were trapped in a complex cave system in Chiang Ri. They were found by British divers on Monday, 9 days after they'd gone missing. President Trump has narrowed his list of Supreme Court candidates to 3. Speculators named Judges Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett as the top 2, with Raymond Kethledge a possible 3rd, even though imminent, an announcement is scheduled for Monday. Which brings us to our story of the week, the Supreme Court, what's at stake? Dr. David Canervo, our resident historian, is going to bring us the backstory on the court. David?
Thank you, Tom. The United States Supreme Court came into existence in 1789 when the Constitution went into effect. It is one of the 3 co-equal national institutions of the federal government, along with the executive and legislative branches. Justices on the Supreme Court are appointed by the President and confirmed by majority vote in the Senate. The current size of the Supreme Court is 9 members, but through our history, the size has ranged from 6 to 10. The Supreme Court is primarily an appellate court, meaning most of its cases arrive there on appeal from a lower federal court or the highest state court if a federal issue is involved. 4 justices must vote to hear a case, and a majority vote is required to decide the case. We like to think the justices of the Supreme Court are above politics and that their decisions are based solely on the law, but that is not the case. Politics is involved in the selection process by the President because he wants someone on the court who will agree with his positions. Members of each political party in the Senate want to confirm appointees who agree with the general position of their parties. 2 justices can look at the same wording in the Constitution and come to different opinions about what it means. That's because no justice arrives at the court as a blank slate, devoid of any opinions about how society or the nation should function. Who sits on the court makes a difference that can last for 40 years or more. Ken?
Thank you, David. Before we get started, I wanted to announce that U.S. World Report has an email address for our audience to send in their comments, and it's pretty simple. It's usworldreport@gmail.com. Now, let's begin with this historical clip about a 1901 Supreme Court decision desperately in need of an update. It involves American territories, and the content of this story may be politically disturbing. It's from AJ Plus Media.
Puerto Rico was suddenly on everyone's minds after Hurricane Maria. One question kept coming up. What does it mean to be a U.S. territory? Puerto Rico is just one of many U.S. territories, including the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam. But many Americans hardly ever think about them.
Most members of Congress, they couldn't find Guam on a map, and they don't want to because it's completely off their radar.
The 4 million Americans who live in these territories can serve in the military, but they can't vote for president. Each territory has one representative in Congress, but that representative can't actually vote either. U.S. territories are essentially American colonies.
There's a footnote attached to America's empire, and it's called Guam.
Way out in the western Pacific, this island of 160,000 people is the furthest west you can get and still say you're on American soil. And since it's close to Asia, it's the perfect location for a U.S. military base, which is why the military controls more than a quarter of the island's land. Driving around Guam, you can't miss that this is America. You can hear planes taking off from Andersen Air Force Base. Tourists shoot guns at Wild West-style ranges and snap photos in front of a replica of the Statue of Liberty. But like the other territories, Guam is not fully American.
Since Guam is considered a possession of the U.S. but not part of the U.S., the Constitution doesn't apply. And so even today, we still do not have the full applicability of the Constitution.
That's because of a series of decisions called the Insular Cases.
So the U.S. Supreme Court, right, the highest court in the land, basically in 1901, decides that based on race, based on this idea that these places are populated by, quote, alien races, the Constitution wouldn't be applied. Basically, alien races are incapable of understanding Anglo-Saxon principles.
In Guam's case, by alien races, they meant the indigenous Chamorro people who have lived on the island for more than 3,000 years.
Tom Osborne, were you surprised by the story that seems to be 117 years old and perhaps due for an update?
Well, perhaps. I definitely think it's due for an update. Ken and most of the country, I think, is looking at the court and feeling the same. There are people on both sides of some very critical issues facing us right now. The White House, of course, has spoken to the 3 potential nominees, but that is in addition to the 4 he met with previously. Based on the multiple news sources, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others, we've got a pretty good idea of who the 7 are on the short list. The president's pick will be revealed in just a few days, with the potential to shape American life, politics, and a culture for a generation. And you can be sure that the president wants to shape the High Court in his image. The White House, of course, is not showing its hand, not publicly at least. Huckabee Sanders, his spokeswoman, says he's seeking someone with great intellect. Also, the right judicial temperament, somebody who is going to uphold the Constitution. Both sides are lining up for a political fight on this. Some persons on the short list have surely had a bigger fight than others. One person, NBC reports, has called Roe v. Wade the worst abomination in the history of constitutional law. NBC reported another person interviewed by the president is a staunchly conservative Catholic who allegedly told law students their legal career should be viewed as, quote, a means to an end in building the kingdom of God. Another interviewed has never been a judge at all. That's Senator Mike Lee of Utah, and confirmed that the president has talked with Lee about the job on Monday. But no matter who gets picked from the president's short list of conservatives, most assuredly will not be a consensus choice. According to a new poll from NBC News and SurveyMonkey, 44% said the pick should be a moderate, compared to 33% who say it should be a conservative, 20% who say it should be a liberal. The Democratic leaders have called on Republicans to wait until after the midterms before a confirmation vote, but not at all any signs that Senator McConnell would agree to that. And so we'll have to wait and see. Ken?
Well, Dr. Canervo, does it disturb you that places, these territories like Puerto Rico and Guam, they have one congressional representative who's not able to vote? The population is unable to vote, and yet this just continues. How did this happen?
Well, it happened because the territories are not states as part of the United States. To vote for president, they have to have electoral votes. And of course, electoral votes are given only to those states because they have, based on the number of representatives and the 2 United States senators. The one exception occurred for the District of Columbia, which up until I think it was the 1970s could not vote for president themselves because they did not have any electoral votes, not being states. a constitutional amendment was passed to give the District of Columbia electoral votes, and the same could happen to give territories electoral votes, but that's what it would take to do that. The Constitution, I think, is pretty clear about who has rights to vote and who doesn't, and so to give the territories the kind of representation that would make them equal to states would require two things. Number one, either pass a law which makes them a state, or secondly, amend the Constitution. Ken?
You're listening to U.S. World Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to U.S. World Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. This next audio clip is from ABC News and is titled Supreme Court Republican Concerns. Now let's give this a listen.
Back here now to the battle for the Supreme Court, 1 week to the day after Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his resignation. President Trump taking time out from his search to host a 4th of July picnic. But the president is closing in on a choice and promising a home run. But not all conservatives will agree with the man some consider a front-runner. ABC's Tara Palmieri is at the White House.
Just days away from announcing a Supreme Court pick, President Trump tonight welcoming military families to the White House 4th of July picnic.
Happy 4th of July. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
In the week since Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement, the president has already met with at least 7 possible replacements.
This is such an important decision, and we're going to give you a great one. We're going to announce it on Monday.
Republican leaders now jockeying to influence his choice. And tonight, some taking aim at one leading candidate, Brett Kavanaugh, a 53-year-old judge on the Federal Court of Appeals and former official in the George W. Bush administration. He's embraced Chief Justice John Roberts' edict that judges should be more like umpires.
Don't be a jerk. I think that's important, to be a good umpire and a good judge. Don't be a jerk.
He's also said judges should be willing to change.
It means having an open mind. It means a willingness to change your mind. That's something that judges have to do, to say, well, I didn't look at it that way a few years ago, but now I see that it looks different to me.
That has some Republicans worried Kavanaugh won't be a reliable conservative vote on the court. ABC News has learned Senators Rand Paul, Tom Cotton, and Ted Cruz have all called the president, expressing concerns.
Tara Palmieri joins us now from the White House. And Tara, lots of attention on Judge Kavanaugh, as we just saw in your story there. But there are other candidates on that short list as well, and social conservatives have their own favorite.
Tom, White House officials tell me that anti-abortion groups are privately pushing for Judge Amy Coney Barrett. She's a mother of 7 and a devout Catholic. They're hoping that she'll be a reliable vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. Tom?
Tara Palmieri with that new reporting tonight. Tara, thank you.
Well, guys, days before President Trump is expected to announce his pick for the U.S. Supreme Court, local and national organizations are ratcheting up pressure on Republican U.S. Senator Susan Collins of Maine to reject a nominee who would overturn Roe v. Wade. Tom, isn't that what this is all about, Roe v. Wade?
Indeed, Ken. And there's new evidence that the public does not want to delay this confirmation battle either. That's kind of interesting. The majority said the Senate should vote on this pick before the November elections, which leaves Democrats racing against the clock in a battle against everything they stand for, including Roe v. Wade, not to mention voting rights, health care, and beyond. Democrats for sure are in a bind, but with Republicans holding the slimmest of a majority in the Senate, there isn't much room for them either. Ken?
Well, make no mistake, the rights and freedoms of more than 300 million people are on the line. This was said by Eliza Townsend, the executive director of Maine's Women's Lobby, in a conference call last Thursday. Now, Townsend and the leaders of other progressive organizations, including the AFL-CIO and the Maine's Conservation Voters, called on Collins and U.S. Senator Angus King, a Maine independent, to closely scrutinize any nominee. And now Trump has been interviewing candidates drawn from a 25-person list created by the Federalist Society, an organization of conservative and libertarian leading lawyers. He has said he will announce a candidate on Monday. David, has he narrowed this number down from 25?
Yes, it appears that there are 7 people. He has interviewed 7. And so I would certainly think that any one of those people could be the nominee. Ken?
They're being referred to as the Super 7, I believe, or the Majestic 7. They've got all kinds of nicknames for this group. Townsend said the nominees selected by the Federalist Society have a common ideology that would make our country go backwards. Tom, do you agree with that statement?
I think it's a real possibility. All of the sort of progressive programs that the country, I'd say majority of voters want, will be on the line, and not to mention Roe v. Wade, a right for women to choose, will be overturned, most likely. According to some columnists, maybe not really overturned necessarily, but functionally really cut back. Even conservatives are sensitive to the idea that how the Supreme Court would be perceived if we once woke up and saw on the news that Roe had been overturned. If they could do it more judiciously, they say, a little bit more slowly, it would give states more freedom to restrict abortion. That might be one strategy they go for. This is in spite of the fact that the country does not want Roe v. overturned. A new poll says that the Supreme Court should uphold Roe 61% to 31%. Ken?
Well, Tom, as a follow-up, Collins, as a moderate Republican, is in a key position to influence the debate over who will replace retiring Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, along with the colleague Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, another GOP moderate. Tom, the follow-up question is, did Supreme Justice Kennedy and Donald Trump have a long-standing relationship? Can you describe what that is?
Well, it's a very kind of a strange relationship that they had. It involves, I think, one of his relatives. By law, the 9 are not supposed to rule on cases in which a family member is involved, where they have a financial interest or where they participated in a previous job. Well, as a matter of fact, Justice Stephen Breyer's brother, a federal district court judge in San Francisco, had heard a similar case as Breyer a few years prior. But the court press office didn't reveal the reason for Breyer's recusal at the time. There was no explanation from the Chief Justice, John Roberts, and nothing was posted online. Breyer's recusal demonstrates, though, that the justices take ethics seriously to some extent, and the public should be informed about it. That would build confidence in the institution, of course. That the justices don't announce their public appearances is another disconcerting aspect of their practice. Placing their annual financial disclosure reports online like other branches is a good example of good citizenship. We can easily search the web for a presidential candidate's corporate board appointments or a senator's stock holdings, but not necessarily the Supreme Court. Justice Breyer clearly does have all the answers of what can be done to restore the public's faith in the court, but it's important that he's asking the questions, and it sounds as if he's fed up. Ken?
Dr. Canervo, the relationship between President Trump and Supreme Court Justice John Roberts, it's a bit strained these days. Can you explain why?
Well, it's strained, I think, because Chief Justice Roberts was the deciding vote which upheld the Affordable Care Act, perhaps better known as Obamacare. He was the deciding vote in which he said that the funding mechanism was not so much a fee that was being charged and therefore unconstitutional, but rather a tax, which was very constitutional. And so as a result, during this first court challenge of the Affordable Care Act, Roberts was the vote that upheld it. And so I think that is probably the key factor right now, which has led to tension between those two gentlemen. Ken?
Under current rules, nominees to the Supreme Court must be confirmed by a majority in the 100-member Senate. Republicans have 51 members, but Senator John McCain may not be able to vote because of health issues. So confirming the nominee would require every other Republican senator's support unless a Democrat crosses party lines. What's the chance of that, Tom Osborne?
Well, I think the chances are, I wouldn't say great, but they're possible. Senator McCain says the country has been damaged to a degree that it hasn't been in history. He has very strong views about this election. He also pointed out that in the House, when you're in the majority, you control everything. and we're now headed in that direction, and that is not a democracy. McCain's concern was that future nominees to the highest court in the land will be more radical because a simple majority could now ram someone through who agreed with those members' point of view. Ken?
One final thought about Chief Justice John Roberts. He's made it very clear that he considers Roe v. Wade to be a settled law. You're listening to U.S. World Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. We're up against a hard break, but we'll be back right after this.
Welcome back. I'm David Canervo, along with Ken McCaleb, Mary Saliba, and Tom Osborne, and we're talking about the United States Supreme Court. Ken?
Thank you, David. Here's a Fox News audio clip about one of the top candidates with a bit of controversy. I'll call it Once in Love with Amy. That's Amy Coney Barrett.
We decided to take a closer look at Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett received a shocking introduction to Washington politics when she faced off with Democratic senators last year at her confirmation hearing to sit on the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals.
The dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern.
Barrett's response was measured but on point.
If you're asking whether I take my faith seriously, and I'm a faithful Catholic, I am, although I would stress that my personal church affiliation or my religious belief would not bear on the discharge of my duties as a judge.
It is the 46-year-old's perceived views on the intersection of faith and the law that has drawn praise from conservatives and concern among progressives. She told a 2006 Notre Dame Law School graduating class, quote, "Your legal career is but a means to an end, and that end is building the kingdom of God. If you can keep in mind that your fundamental purpose in life is not to be a lawyer, but to know, love, and serve God, you truly will be a different kind of lawyer." The rhetoric matches that of her mentor, Justice Antonin Scalia. She recalled he was a tough but fair boss.
In these conferences where you debated the merits of cases, you really had to be on your feet. You had to know your stuff inside and out. You had to be articulate.
Like the late Justice, Barrett has a large family. She's the mother of 7 children. Barrett's talked about the challenges of juggling a busy home life and an academic career as a law school professor. But it was her successful political audition to serve as a judge that sources say impressed the White House. Much of the Senate's focus was on abortion rights.
And you have no personal beliefs as to whether Roe was correctly decided.
I'm sure that every nominee before you has beliefs about that precedent and many other, but all nominees are united in their belief that what they think about a precedent should not bear on how they would decide cases.
Dr. Canervo, can you comment on Ms. Barrett's chances of securing the nomination?
Well, I think they are fairly good. Whether President Trump would be willing to go all the way to nominate her, of course, remains to be seen. On the one hand, the Constitution makes it very clear that there should be no religious test for holding public office. And so her Catholicism should not be an issue which bars her from holding a judgeship. But as I said in my opening, no judge enters upon a court seat as a clean slate. They all come with ideas and prejudices and values that have been inculcated in them throughout their lives. And so she would be no different. And whether she sees it or not, I can't help but believe that her Catholic beliefs may have an impact on her view of Roe versus Wade.
Tom Osborne, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, said Sunday on the CBS program Face the Nation that Trump doesn't need to ask where nominees stand on overturning Roe versus Wade because his list has already been screened on that issue by the Federalist Society. Would you agree to that statement, Tom?
Yes, I would agree to that statement. I think most likely the president has definitely chosen against Roe v. Wade, and all of the lists, as I understand it, have been cleared by the society, and therefore they would have that as an underpinning. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, as a follow-up, Tom, the political moment for Trump was fragile as a president devoted to his base weighed what a Kavanaugh selection could mean for him, unfolding amid a flurry of op-eds and phone calls praising the 53-year-old judge, as well as a clamor from those who see him as out of step on health care and abortion, or too tied to George W. Bush's White House. Now, Tom, why is this considered baggage?
This is baggage from an administration which had great hopes to put the United States back where it belonged in the Mideast after dealing with the activities of Saddam Hussein, and that was a very controversial decision which has left us scratching our heads, many Americans. Also, the choice between President Gore at that time making him not president. I think that's still in the history. But according to Democrats, thanks to a stolen Supreme Court, as in using their words, the court has now moved to further disempower them. And some describe it as a dark cycle of the Democratic decline, and as to polling opposition, could care less what the rest of the country wants. In other words, to impose the will of a small minority on the rest of us, and that's what this minority loves this president. Ken?
President Trump has asked aides about Kavanaugh's opinions on health care that have frustrated some conservatives, according to two people close to the president who were not authorized to speak publicly. They added that Trump has pored over news articles spotlighting Kavanaugh's history with Bush and part of the powerful political family that has vocally opposed Trump, but they did not see it as a fatal strike against him. Dr. Canervo, do you see it as a fatal strike?
I don't know that I do, though certainly considering Trump's personality, it could be a factor, very much so. A couple of things, though, which I think might be a problem for Kavanaugh are, number one, the fact that he was a prosecutor under Kenneth Starr, who, of course, conducted the very long investigation into the Clintons. I'm sure the Democrats are not excited about that in that part of their history, and they might very well hold that against him, whereas conservative Republicans might not be very comfortable with Kavanaugh's statement that he's going to be open-minded and listen to arguments that perhaps he hadn't thought about much before, which opens up the notion that he might very well end up being a swing voter, as Kennedy was, or that he might in fact end up even being more moderate to liberal, as Justice Souter ended up being. And so there are all sorts of possibilities and all sorts of things that could very well sway Trump's nomination against Kavanaugh for those reasons. Ken?
Well, Tom, I want you to comment on this. There's a whisper campaign that's going on out there trying to destroy Kavanaugh, and it could be legit, and this is according to syndicated radio show host Rush Limbaugh. He told his listeners last Monday, the long knives are out from the people from all sides of the aisle, folks.
Well, it doesn't seem to matter where the knives are pointed or what the ultimate place of attack is going to be. There's got to be one person out of this group that's chosen, and everybody has their candidate. And the Republicans know how to fight just like the Democrats, and so I think we'll see a battle, but ultimately it will come down to just the president's announcement. Ken?
You're listening to U.S. World Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. We'll be back right after these messages, so stay with us.
Welcome back to U.S. World Report. I'm Tom Osborne with Ken McCaleb, Dr. David Canervo, and Mary Saliba. Today we're talking about the Supreme Court showdown. What's at stake? Ken?
Thanks, Tom. Just who are the Magnificent Seven Supreme Court candidates President Donald Trump has in mind? This clip is from NBC News.
Thinking about Supreme Court justice is such an important decision, and we're going to give you a great one. We're going to announce it on Monday. I think you'll be very impressed. These are very talented people, brilliant people, and I think you're going to really love it, like Justice Gorsuch. We hit a home run there, and we're going to hit a home run here. Step by step, we are making America great again.
President Trump offering an update about his potential Supreme Court picks during his event in West Virginia earlier this evening. The president promised to reveal his choice next Monday, July 9th. The White House says President Trump spoke to 3 potential picks today. That's a total of 7 so far this week. We can assume that Senator Mike Lee was one of those 7 people interviewed by the president. A spokesman for the Republican senator confirmed to NBC News that the president spoke to Lee by phone on Monday and that the senator was in Utah. Robert Costa of the Washington Post reports President Trump interviewed Judges Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, Amul Thapar, and Raymond Kethledge on Monday, and a source with firsthand knowledge of the situation tells NBC News those 4 judges are indeed under consideration, along with Senator Lee, Thomas Hardiman, and Joan Larson. Here to talk about it all, Shannon Pettypiece, White House correspondent for Bloomberg. She was traveling with the president tonight. Shannon, let's start with you. You were with the president in West Virginia. He spoke about, one of the first things he spoke about was the Supreme Court. You get a sense he's happy with how this is playing out?
We do. He's still planning to make a decision by Monday, any day now. He's been really charging along on this. This is something he could have anticipated coming, so it's not one of those issues that came out of nowhere. But, I mean, for him, he's in a position where he can score a lot of positive points with his base. I mean, can you get someone through Congress? That will be Congress's problem. But if he picks a solid conservative, pro-life justice, his supporters and his base, they will love him for it, and it will really overcome a lot of, the other shortcomings that he's had in their eyes over the past year or so.
Tom Osborne, would you care to comment on the Magnificent Seven Democratic Party response?
Well, the Democratic Party response is basically trying anything they can get on their list of tools in their toolbox to get this president to appoint someone at least middle of the road, or at least balanced in terms of both parties. But that seems highly unlikely, and people are looking desperately to the midterm elections. But as one Republican put it, this is why polling is important. We know that the administration will make this decision, and we have the votes. So what do the Democrats look at? The midterm elections and how it's going to affect them. It is believed on all sides this conservative pick will motivate Democrats, and that's important. That's when millennials and basically the Democrats have a strong possibility of taking back the House. If they accomplish that, there will be many rushing to make the I word stick, and if they do, there will be a lot of scrambling to make the word impeachment go away by the Democrats. After that, who knows? Ken?
A 2016 case over the contraceptive mandate in President Barack Obama's health care law has also drawn attention. Kavanaugh sided with the group Priests for Life, but in his opinion, he wrote that Supreme Court precedent strongly suggests that the government has a compelling interest in facilitating access to contraception, but that there were less restrictive means of furthering that interest. Dr. Canervo, that seems rather odd. That's a somewhat liberal point of view, wouldn't you say?
Well, yes, and I think what that says is that Kavanaugh is open-minded, as he himself has described himself, about issues and about the law. So you can understand why the hard-nosed conservatives are going to be worried about a Kavanaugh appointment, because you're never quite sure where he might go. Just as conservatives were upset about Justice Roberts and the Affordable Care Act, they were upset at times with Justice Kennedy. Kavanaugh is going to be in some ways a loose gun, I suppose, that you're never quite sure where the aim is going to be. Ken?
Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation fight has also propelled the Notre Dame Law School alumni and professor to a certain legal stardom among conservatives. And many Kavanaugh critics have cited her as their favorite because of that experience and what they described as an appealing profile for a court full of Ivy League graduates. Tom, do you see any advantage to having an Ivy League group in the Supreme Court?
Definitely. I think that's we're going to be speaking directly to those that will be in power at that time and running the country. So that would be more than a very good sign that the court is changing and growing with the times in which it lives. And that's also something that people are asking questions about as to how relative is the court to our daily problems? Is it so removed that it really becomes almost useless to us? In fact, many people see it as a problem. But however, of course, it's the court of last resort. And when it speaks, that is the law. So we'll just have to wait and see how things pan out here. Ken?
Well, gentlemen, it's time for rapid fire. Are you ready?
Yes.
Well, David, I'll begin with you. Many legal experts say that the nominations process is a wholly political question and not a question that would ever come before the Supreme Court. Would you agree that a U.S. Senator can vote for or against a nominee to the Supreme Court for any reason?
Absolutely. It is very much a political process. Presidents appoint justices to the Supreme Court for political reasons, and people vote as senators for or against candidates for political reasons. So, Ken, it is a political process.
Tom Osborne, nominees frequently come from the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they treat the committee questioning of a nominee as a test of how much the nominee knows about the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent. Would you agree that the nomination process should be more than the functional equivalent of a pass-fail examination on constitutional law?
Well, I think most Americans feel that way, particularly now in this very controversial time in which we're picking not only one justice that may be conservative, but two, and that the potential of the whole progressive platform in America might just go down the drain. So there's real desperation out there, Ken.
David, if a nominee refuses to answer the Senate's question about nominees' philosophy, ideology, and record, then a U.S. Senator has little basis to understand whether a nominee will be appropriate for a lifetime appointment on the bench. Do you agree that a senator should say nay on any nominee who, outside of a narrow, legitimate legal ethics basis, refuses to answer questions about the nominee's philosophy, ideology, and record?
Well, I think it depends on how the refusal to answer is stated, actually. If, in some general sense, there's a strong possibility that a case involving the issue that the nominee is asked about could come up, or certainly is pending in a lower court, I think it's very legitimate for a nominee to not answer the question. It's been a long-standing tradition that judges not state how they're going to rule on a case before a case arrives at the court. Ken?
Tom, some lawyers believe that the Constitution is a living document which grows to recognize new rights, and others believe that the Constitution should be interpreted according to its plain words and original meaning. Do you believe that the Constitution is living, and if so, how should a judge determine what new rights to create and what laws passed by the people must be cast aside?
I wish I were an attorney. I could answer all those questions, but for sure I can answer the first one, and that is I think the court should be balanced, and I think there should be a process in which justices are chosen in a way that represents the general population, if that's possible. Even, in fact, the probability of increasing the number of justices on the court, not in a sense of packing the court, but in terms of getting a fair distribution, Ken.
Well, you're listening to U.S. World Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Mary Saliba, and Ken McCaleb. We're going to come back and we're going to try and summarize today's show, and we're going to hear the editorial comments from Miss Mary Saliba, so stay with us. Welcome back to U.S. World Report, and this is our show's summary segment where we get a chance to share some final thoughts. And we now turn to our news team editorialist, Miss Mary Saliba. Mary?
Thanks, Ken. When we get angry at the government, usually it's in line with our politics, and we know it. But we want the Supreme Court to be different. It's the marker of the most just our country can be. When we are at a fight, we have that one last hope for justice. We will take it to the Supreme Court. But it's a body comprised of 9 humans. Of course it's not perfect. Like the Constitution which established the court, it has not only been created to help form a more perfect union, it's been tasked with what it means involving possibilities that didn't exist in 1789. With an open seat and controversial laws suddenly uncertain, all eyes are on SCOTUS, and it's personal. And it feels urgent. It is urgent. but lifetime seats on the bench have always been tools in partisan politics. Samuel Chase, appointed by George Washington, was impeached for partisanship, though he was acquitted by the Senate. When Justice Scalia died in 2016, President Obama promptly appointed Merrick Garland, and the Senate infamously refused to act on this nomination, allowing the next president to appoint Neil Gorsuch quickly. The Senate even changed the rules to do so. Though there have been Senate filibusters in at least one block, presidential appointees are historically confirmed, but refusing to act at all was unprecedented. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said in August of 2016, "One of my proudest moments was when I looked at Barack Obama in the eye and I said, 'Mr. President, you will not fill this Supreme Court vacancy.'" This remark added fury to the confusion a lot of Americans already felt, wondering how this was even possible. Now filling Kennedy's seat, the volatility of Roe v. Wade is such that potential justices seem to be vetted through a one-issue filter, highlighting how much we have at stake. Not only specific and hard-won rights, but faith in our own country. If we believe that our constitutional rights will not be honored unless our own politics are reflected by all three branches of the government, then we have a shaky democracy and a much bigger problem than the next big case. This has been Mary Saliba for U.S. World Report. Ken?
Thanks, Mary. You know, if I had a chance to ask one bonus question, would you ever ask a Supreme Court nominee, where do you see yourself, say, in the next 10 years? And I know their answer might be, well, right here on the bench, unless someone was bold enough to try and impeach me. David, would you please share your final thoughts about today's show?
Well, one of the candidates for the Supreme Court who really has not received much attention is Amul Thapar, the Indian American candidate. What interests me about him is that he is like Nikki Haley in the sense that he has the Indian background. We have seen that President Trump has already appointed Ms. Haley to the United Nations, and so perhaps it would be interesting to see if he would appoint another Indian American. He might be a good appointment because it would be difficult to oppose him for fear of calls of racism. What also strikes me about him is that he says that I'm my own judge, and I hope my track record speaks to that, which suggests to me that he also might be somewhat more open-minded than perhaps some of the other nominees. So perhaps he's my nominee for the Black Horse candidate. Ken?
Tom Osborne, anybody who's ever been through a job interview gets the inevitable question, why do you want this job? In our last 45 seconds, how would you summarize today's show? And as always, you have final say.
Well, I think everyone is looking toward a magic bullet, something that will save the Democrats in the Supreme Court search. And I think if they get their wish on January 1st of 2019, progressive Democrats will reach for the impeachment button. The process will then be consumed by lots of noise and reaction, unless, of course, there's some clear ruling against the administration. Those who knew that all along will gain strength. I guess we'll have to wait, though, because we're out of time and we have to seek new questions and answers for next week to these vexing challenges facing our country. We're out of time for this week's broadcast, and we hope that you'll join me, Tom Osborne, Ken McCaleb, Dr. David Pinervo, and our editorialist, Mary Saliba, next week for another edition of U.S. World Report. Thanks for listening.